I'm Emily, and for the community engagement assignment, I chose a setting that would be considered out of the box compared to those my classmates observed. In the last few years, the church I attend, called Webster, has implemented the buddy system for children who need additional help in order to participate in classes at church. Currently, we have one student that has been diagnosed with autism that is benefiting from this service every Sunday morning and Wednesday evening. For this assignment, we'll refer to him as Jacob. Jacob and his family started attending Webster almost 2 years ago. Jacob, age 10, is the oldest of 4 children, and he's the only child diagnosed with a disability in the family unit. So the buddy system has been in place for about a year now. We have 10 volunteers who rotate through on Sunday mornings and 3 that rotate through on Wednesday nights. Since Sundays are usually hectic, I decided to observe Jacob on a Wednesday night. The night I observed Jacob, his buddy was Mr. David. He's been working with Jacob from the start, so he's familiar with Jacob, his needs, limits, and most importantly, his likes and strengths. The observation started with Mr. David telling me a bit about Jacob's normal routine on a Wednesday night. Jacob had not arrived, so Mr. David walked me through it. On the nights that Mr. David is Jacob's buddy, his goal is to keep him in the room with kids around his age, and it varies from buddy to buddy as to what they prefer. Miss Tammy, Mr. David's wife, leads a class for 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. He said that it all depends on Jacob's mood as to whether he stays in the class or he gets pulled out separately. The class that Jacob is in has a routine structure, and Miss Tammy keeps to it because she knows the importance it holds with students like Jacob due to her job as an occupational therapist. When Jacob first arrives, Mr. David checks his backpack to see what his mother sent with him. He said that they recently discovered that if Jacob is chewing gum, he is more settled and content to stay in the classroom with the other kids. Basically, Mr. David said that it's a coping mechanism for him. If he doesn't have gum to chew, he puts things in his mouth like his fingers, different toys. He also grinds his teeth if he isn't chewing on a piece of gum, which I noticed a lot. When Jacob arrived, Mr. David introduced me. I bent down to his level to say hi, however, Jacob wouldn't make eye contact with me. He was constantly moving and fidgeting with his hands. From that point, I just followed and silently observed. Every now and then, Mr. David would explain something or mention something about the progress Jacob has made or what modifications he makes to make Jacob feel included. The class size that night was 10 kids, including Jacob, and there was no helper for Miss Tammy. Normally, she has a second person. Mr. David started out by taking Jacob to the bathroom, explaining that he usually takes him at the beginning and the middle of class. Jacob's had a few accidents, and since he is nonverbal, it's hard for him to vocalize his need to use the restroom. After the bathroom break, we pulled out some wooden blocks, and Jacob sat on the floor and played with those, while Miss Tammy had the other kids complete an activity sheet. I noticed that when Jacob played with the blocks, he found it humorous when he dropped them from above his head and they would bounce. Mr. David explained that Jacob loves to have something in his hands at all times. He would roll the blocks over and over in his hands between his fingers. He would put them on the ground and roll them. If Mr. David started building something, he would add on. But other than that, he was content rolling and dropping them and knocking down Mr. David's tower. I noticed even before Mr. David mentioned it that Jacob could sit there for hours doing just that. A few of the other students, after they had finished their sheet, asked if they could come and play with Jacob and Mr. David. One in particular was very engaged and patient with Jacob. He would build towers for Jacob to knock down, and he would also drop blocks from above his head just to make Jacob laugh and smile. This carried on throughout the entire 2 hours. When the class moved from the activity sheet to the music time, Mr. David encouraged Jacob to turn and watch his classmates and listen to the songs. He said that his mother had heard him singing them at home, so although he wasn't fully engaged, or didn't appear to be engaged, he was learning. After music time, we moved to the lesson, and then prayer time with the kids on the floor sitting in a circle. Mr. David sat with Jacob in the circle. As the other kids went around the circle with prayer requests, one of the other kids said to Miss Tammy and Mr. David, "Does Jacob have any prayer requests?" It was obvious that the kids wanted to include Jacob in everything they did. They were aware of his feelings and that he was only just a little different, but also aware that they were a lot alike. After prayer time, Miss Tammy had a food activity planned, and Mr. David said that Jacob was always 100% involved in any activity if it was hands-on and it had anything to do with food. Jacob's classmates made a space for him at the table, and the one student who was previously playing blocks with Jacob wanted him to sit next to him. That student, although what some teachers might call a disruption, did everything he could to get a laugh out of Jacob. The activity involved building a tower out of icing and graham crackers, and that other student would put icing on his face and then make a silly face at Jacob just to get him to laugh. Mr. David did most of the building and Jacob did most of the eating, but he stood at the table for the entire activity. Miss Tammy allowed the children to stand or sit as long as they were paying attention or engaged in what is going on. The student who was interacting with Jacob also stood for the majority of the activity. This kid, I came to find, also had ADHD. He was diagnosed with ADHD. So, Mr. David, after the activity, the kids had free time. Some were finishing their towers, some were playing with the blocks. We had pulled out for Jacob, and some were just walking around and talking to their classmates. Mr. David said that was sitting with Jacob in his lap after they had finished, and a few of the other girls went over to play with Jacob and Mr. David. They would play a modified version of hide and seek or peekaboo, whichever you want to call it. They would run behind Mr. David and Jacob, and then they would run back in front of them and make a silly face, and they would do it over and over and over again. Each time Jacob would laugh like it was the funniest thing that he had ever seen. It was clear that including Jacob in this class was the best fit and most appropriate place. After Jacob left, Mr. David mentioned that this was a good night for Jacob. There have been many nights or Sunday mornings when he comes in and doesn't want to have anything to do with the other kids. If it gets too loud, he goes into a tantrum, throwing, hitting, yelling, crying, and covering his ears. Jacob is super sensitive to sound and will sometimes wear noise-canceling headphones, like the big ones. Typically, they will take a sensory box full of rice and little toys into the gym and let him play alone, or Mr. David will pull him around in the wagon in the gym, or they'll play with all of the gym equipment. Usually, those activities are used when Jacob isn't able to stay in the classroom with his peers. I did observe that he uses sounds, noises, grunts, giggles to express his emotions instead of words, but his classmates and teachers and buddies didn't seem to have any issue with that, and they didn't seem to mind it. They just went with it. Overall, from observing Jacob, I realized the impact inclusion can have on a child with disabilities. When he was in the room with his classmates, although he didn't interact like the other kids, it didn't stop the other children from wanting to interact with him. They wanted him to feel included and to enjoy himself. The lengths that some of his classmates went to in order to include him were noticed. Jacob wasn't defined by his disability in that atmosphere. He was their friend and nothing more, nothing less. Mr. David was clear that he did his best to keep Jacob in the room with his peers because he wanted Jacob to have social interactions and to make friends. He voiced that it was important for Jacob to be around kids his own age. The benefits of a child with disabilities that they receive from being included, with the understanding that some things will have to be changed or adjusted, can make the biggest difference in a child's life.